I was born in the spring of 1846 in Indiana. My father worked as a schoolteacher, which made our family a little different from most others living on the frontier. We were not rich, but we had books in our home, and I learned to read and write when I was still very young. My mother had come from Massachusetts and brought Eastern manners and learning into the rough Indiana wilderness. She strongly believed that girls should be educated the same as boys, that a woman needed knowledge if she wished to make her way in this world. I had 2 younger sisters and 1 brother. We lived in a small town where my father taught at the local schoolhouse. Life felt steady and predictable. I believed I would marry a man from our town, raise my children there, and spend my whole life within 20 miles of where I had been born. That was what most girls did. That was what people expected. But then I met James Crawford. James arrived in Indiana in 1863 when I was 17 years old. He was from Ohio and was 25. He had served for a short time in the Union Army before being discharged because of illness. He was a restless man filled with big dreams about the West. He spoke often about Oregon and about the Willamette Valley, where land was free for the taking, where a man could build something meaningful, where the future was being shaped. My father did not approve of James at all. He said James was a dreamer without practical sense, and that he would chase chances across the country and never settle long enough to build anything lasting. My mother was kinder in her judgment. She said James reminded her of her own father, who had moved the family from Massachusetts to Indiana looking for opportunity. She said, "Some men were born with wandering hearts, and if I married James, I would need to accept that truth." I was 18 and believed that love would be enough. I believed that if James wished to go west, then I would go west beside him, and together we would build our new life in Oregon. We were married in the spring of 1864. By autumn, we were already preparing for the long journey. We spent the winter collecting supplies and saving as much money as possible. James worked at a mill and took every extra shift he could manage. I sewed clothing and washed laundry for other families and saved every coin. By March of 1865, we had gathered enough. We purchased a wagon, not new but strong enough for the trail. We bought 2 oxen and supplies meant to last 6 months. Everything the guidebook said we would require. In April of 1865, we joined a wagon train gathering in St. Joseph, Missouri. There were 38 wagons in our company, and perhaps 140 people altogether. The wagon master was a man called Samuel Potter, who had made the journey twice before. He was a stern man but experienced, and everyone said that if you wished to reach Oregon safely, Potter was the man you wanted leading the way. We left St. Joseph on April 20th, 1865. The war had just ended. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox 2 weeks earlier, and there was a feeling of new beginnings and fresh chances. Every person on that wagon train was running towards something or away from something, or away from something. We were all dreamers in one way or another, all believing Oregon would be better than whatever we had left behind. The first weeks passed well. The weather was fair. The trail was open. The oxen were strong. James and I settled into the steady rhythm of wagon train life. We woke before sunrise, ate a simple breakfast, hitched the oxen, and joined the moving line. Most days we walked beside the wagon. Riding was uncomfortable, and the oxen moved slowly enough that walking was easier. On good days we traveled 15 to 20 miles, less when the road was rough or the weather turned bad. James was joyful during those early weeks. He talked constantly about Oregon, about the farm we would create, about the crops we would plant, about the children we would raise. He had everything carefully planned in his mind. We would claim 160 acres under the Donation Land Act. First we would build a small cabin, then a barn, and later a proper house. We would plant wheat and vegetables, raise cattle and chickens. Within 5 years we would be doing well. Within 10 years we would be comfortable. Within 20 years we would be wealthy. I listened to his hopes and tried to feel the same excitement. Yet I was practical in ways James was not. I noticed things he failed to see. I saw that some families were better prepared than we were. with more supplies and stronger wagons. I noticed that some single men traveling with us were rough types who drank too much and caused trouble. I saw that Wagon Master Potter had favorites, families he spoke to warmly and others he barely acknowledged. We belonged to the second group. By late May, we had crossed into what is now Nebraska. The land was beautiful, wide rolling prairie with grass stretching as far as the eye could see, and a sky larger than any I had known. Yet it was also harsh country. The wind never seemed to stop blowing. The sun was cruel. Water was scarce between rivers. The trail was uneven and filled with rocks and deep ruts that could break a wagon wheel if one was careless. James began to struggle. The sickness that had caused his discharge from the army returned. It was a weakness in his lungs and a cough that would not leave him. At first it seemed small, like a heavy cold. But as days went by, it grew worse. He became weak and could not walk beside the wagon all day. He had to ride more. Often, the cough became constant and kept him awake at night. It kept me awake too as I lay beside him, listening to him fight for breath. I began driving the wagon more often as James became unable to manage it. I learned how to handle the oxen, how to keep them steady, how to guide them along the rough road. It was difficult work, harder than anything I had done back in Indiana. My hands blistered and then hardened. My face burned under the sun. My body ached every day from the long hours of walking and labor. At first, other families helped us. The Hendersons, whose wagon traveled near ours, sometimes brought food and helped with heavy tasks James could not do. Mrs. Morrison, an older woman whose husband had died before the journey and who traveled with her grown son, would sit with James in the evenings while I finished chores. She made him herbal teas meant to ease his cough, but as weeks passed and James did not improve, the help slowly faded. People began to keep their distance. I understood their fear. They worried about sickness spreading to their own children. Wagon Master Potter started making remarks about our slow pace and about how James' inability to work was creating trouble for the company. We reached Fort Laramie in early June. The fort was a welcome sight after so many weeks on the trail, a place with buildings and people and a chance to rest. We camped there for 3 days. I hoped the break would strengthen James, but he only worsened. The fort doctor examined him and said his lungs were badly damaged. He said the trail was too difficult for him in such a condition. He advised that we turn back or remain at the fort until James regained strength. But James refused. He said we had traveled too far and invested too much. He said Oregon was our future, and he would reach it even if it cost him his life. Those words frightened me deeply, but I did not. Ragu. I was his wife. Where he went, I followed. That was how marriage was meant to work. We left Fort Laramie with the wagon train, yet everything felt different. The evening after we departed, Potter called a meeting. He said some families were failing to keep pace and were slowing the entire company, putting everyone in danger by forcing the train to move too slowly. He said that if people could not maintain the required speed, they should consider waiting at the next fort or turning back because the company could not crawl across the plains. Everyone knew he meant us. I felt the eyes of the others upon us and sensed their growing resentment. We were the burden. We were the reason for delay. James pushed himself harder after that meeting. He forced his body beyond its limits. He tried to drive the wagon even when he could barely sit upright. He tried to walk, though each step brought violent fits of coughing. I begged him to rest, but he refused. He said he would not be the one who failed and would not be the weight others complained about. In late June, somewhere in what is now Wyoming, James collapsed. That morning he had insisted on driving, though he was clearly unwell. Near mid-morning he suddenly slumped forward and fell from the wagon seat. I cried out, "Stop the oxen," and ran to him. He was barely awake, burning with fever, his breathing shallow and strained. We had no choice but to stop. Several men helped lift James into the wagon and laid him on our bed. Wagon Master Potter rode back to see what had happened. He looked at James and then at me, and his face told me everything before he spoke. That evening he gathered the company again and said we faced a serious problem. He said James Crawford was gravely ill and unlikely to recover on the trail, and that our wagon was dangerously slowing the entire train. He reminded everyone that we were already behind schedule and that if we did not reach the mountains before snow fell, we might all die as the Donner Party had. He said difficult choices must be made for the good of the whole company. He announced that the train would continue at the needed pace and that the Crawford wagon could not keep up. Therefore the Crawford wagon would have to remain behind. I stood frozen as he spoke. Remain behind where? We were in the middle of open country, hundreds of miles from the nearest fort, with a dying husband and no way to survive alone. I found my voice and said we would keep pace. I said I would drive the wagon myself and that James only needed a few days to recover. Potter shook his head and said the decision was final. He said the company could not wait for us. He said other wagon trains would follow in perhaps a week or two, and that we should wait for them, then join when James was stronger. Other voices rose after that. Henderson said it was too severe, that we should at least escort the Crawfords to the next fort. Mrs. Morrison said we must remain together. That was what Christian people were supposed to do, but others did not agree. A man called Silas Burke said Potter was correct, that one family could not risk the safety of the whole group. A woman named Mrs. Safety of the whole group. A woman named Mrs. Fletcher said her children's lives mattered more than helping strangers, that she had not traveled this far to die in the mountains because we were moving too slowly. Potter asked for a vote. Of the 37 wagons still with us, one family had already turned back at Fort Laramie. 21 voted to leave us behind. 16 voted to let us stay with the company. The majority had decided. The following morning, they left us. Potter handed us some extra supplies: flour, bacon, coffee. He said it was all he could give. Mrs. Morrison wept and placed her own shawl around my shoulders. Then they lined up their wagons and headed west, and we stood there watching them fade into the distance. We were alone. I have remembered that moment every single day for 56 years. The sound of wagon wheels moving away, the shouts of the drivers, the sight of that long row of white-covered wagons growing smaller and smaller until they vanished, the deep silence that came after. James was too sick to understand what had happened. He lay inside the wagon, burning with fever, sometimes awake, sometimes lost in it. I sat beside him and tried to decide what to do next. We were camped in a wide valley with good grass and a narrow creek. There were hills to the west, mountains rising beyond them. The trail could be seen stretching east and west, marked by deep ruts from thousands of wagon wheels. But no one was on it. No one coming. No one leaving. Only us. I thought about going back. We had passed a small trading post about 3 days behind. If I could drive the wagon myself, if James could survive the trip, we might reach it. But James was too ill to move. The shaking of the wagon would likely kill him, and I was not sure I could handle the oxen and wagon alone over rough ground. So we stayed. I set up camp properly, raised our tent beside the wagon, carried James into it so he would be more comfortable. I cared for him as best I could, cooled him when the fever burned, warmed him when he shook, gave him water, tried to make him eat. Most of the time he slept, sometimes speaking in confusion, sometimes clear enough to ask what was going on. When he was clear, I lied. I told him the wagon train had stopped to rest for a few days, that we would catch up soon. I did not tell him we had been deserted. I did not tell him we were alone. I wanted to protect him from that truth. I wanted him to believe he had not failed, had not been cast aside. Days went by. I watched the trail, hoping to see another wagon train, but it stayed empty. I had believed there would be wagons every few days. Potter had said so, but none appeared. Maybe we had reached a gap between trains. Maybe others had taken different paths. Maybe they were all far behind and would not arrive for weeks. James grew worse, The fever did not break. His breathing became heavy. He could not eat, could hardly drink. I knew he was dying, but I refused to accept it. I prayed without stopping, begged God to spare him, promised anything if James would just live. On the 8th day after the wagon train left, James died. He passed quietly in the night. He simply stopped breathing as I lay beside him. I woke in the morning and he was gone. I will not try to describe what I felt then. There are no words. I will only say I had never felt so completely alone. I was 21 years old, alone in the wilderness, with no one to help me, no one to comfort me, no one even aware that I was there. I buried James that morning. I dug the grave myself with our camp shovel. It took many hours. The soil was hard. I was weak from little food and almost no sleep, but I dug deep enough to keep animals away. I wrapped James in our best blanket, said the prayers I could remember, and covered him with earth. I placed stones over the grave and carved his name into a piece of wagon wood. James Crawford, born 1838, died July 1865. Then I sat beside the grave and tried to choose my next step. I could try to go west alone, try to catch the wagon train that had left me, but I did not know how far ahead they were. I did not know if I could manage the wagon and oxen alone. I did not know if I could survive the mountains by myself. I could turn back and try to reach the trading post we had passed, but that was at least 3 days' travel, and I would be moving east while everyone else went west. What if another wagon train came dead? I was heading east. I would miss them, so I chose to wait. Surely another wagon train would pass. Surely someone would find me. I only had to survive until then. I waited 3 more days. I stayed in camp, kept the fire burning day and night, so travelers would see the smoke. I watched the trail without rest, stared at the eastern horizon, hoping to see the white tops of wagons, listening for voices or wheels or oxen. But the silence did not break. I had never known such quiet. No voices, no wagons, no signs of civilization, only wind in the grass, the cry of a bird now and then, the creek flowing over stones. Those 3 days felt longer than any days before. I was not just alone. I had been alone in a room before. This was different. This was knowing there was no one within maybe 100 miles in any direction. This was realizing I could die there, and no one would ever know, that my body could lie there for months or years, that I could simply disappear and the world would go on without noticing. I tried to stay busy so I would not think too much. I kept the camp neat, arranged everything the way James would have liked. I washed my clothes in the creek, fixed tears in my dress, counted and organized our remaining supplies. I cooked meals though I had no hunger, forced myself to eat because I needed strength, but at night, despair came. I lay in the tent beside the empty space where James had slept, and the weight of it pressed down on me. I was 21 years old. My husband was dead. I had been left behind by people I believed were a community. I had no clear path to safety. I would likely die there alone, and no one would ever know what happened to me. My parents in Indiana would wait for letters that would never arrive. They would never learn how or where I died. They would never learn how or where I died. They would never have a grave to visit. I thought about ending my life. I had the rifle Henderson had given us. It would be fast. I would not have to face days or weeks of slow hunger, or being found by hostile Indians or dying if the creek dried up. I could choose how it ended, but something inside me would not give up. Maybe it was stubborn pride. Maybe it was my mother's teaching, the belief she placed in me that women were strong enough to endure anything. Maybe it was anger at those who had left me, a need to prove they were wrong about me being too weak to survive. I do not know, but I did not do it. I waited. On the 4th day after James died, I heard a sound. Voices. I ran to the trail and saw riders coming from the east. 4 men on horses riding quickly. I waved and shouted. They noticed me and came over. They were scouts, they said, riding ahead of a wagon train that was about a week behind them. They asked why I was alone. I told them my wagon train had left me, that my husband had died, that I was waiting for help. They looked at one another uneasily. One of them, the oldest, perhaps 40, said they could not stay, that they had to continue scouting the trail. But he said their wagon train would reach this place in about a week, maybe sooner. He told me to remain there, that their wagon master would decide what to do. They gave me some food and then rode away. I watched them head west along the same path as the others. I waited another week. I lived on the little food I had and what the scouts had given me. I grew weak and could barely manage the daily work of keeping camp. But I waited, because there was nothing else I could do. At last the wagon train came, 32 wagons traveling with a military escort, a small group of cavalry guarding them against attack. The wagon master was a man called Captain Miller. He halted the train when he saw me and asked what had taken place. I told him everything, about James's sickness, about Potter's choice to leave us, about James dying, about waiting for help. Miller listened without showing feeling. Then he gathered his people, and they discussed my fate. They argued for an hour. Some families said they should take me with them out of Christian kindness. Others said they were not a rescue party, that I would slow them as I had slowed the last train. Others whispered that I carried bad luck, that death followed me, that bringing me would invite trouble. In the end, Miller said they would take me as far as Fort Bridger, about 2 weeks ahead. There I would have to decide my own path. I could wait for another train, seek work at the fort, or turn back if I wished, but they would not carry me all the way to Oregon. I agreed because I had no choice. I could not remain alone in the wilderness. I had to go with them or perish. They found space for me in a wagon belonging to a family named Peterson, whose wagon was not fully loaded. Mrs. Peterson treated me kindly, fed me, allowed me to sleep inside their wagon at night. But Mr. Peterson made it plain that I was a burden, that they were doing me a favor, that I should feel thankful and keep out of the way. The 2 weeks to Fort Bridger felt like the longest days of my entire life. I was surrounded by people every hour. Yet I had never felt so completely alone. The Petersons allowed me to ride in their wagon and sleep beneath their canvas at night. But they made it clear again and again that this was charity, not friendship. Mrs. Charity, not friendship. Peterson was kind, but in a distant and careful way. She made sure I had enough to eat and gave me small chores to keep my hands busy, but she never once asked about James. She never asked what it had been like to be left behind, to watch my husband fade away. She never treated me like a real person carrying real sorrow. Mr. treated me like a real person carrying real sorrow. Peterson was harder to bear. He showed his resentment openly. He made remarks about how much food I consumed, how much space I occupied, how they had managed well enough before Captain Miller forced them to take me along. He never spoke to me directly. He always referred to me in the third person, even when I stood only a few feet away. She needs to understand we are doing her a kindness, he would tell his wife. She must stay quiet and not cause trouble. The other families avoided me altogether. When we stopped each evening and everyone gathered for supper or quiet talk, they spoke around me as if I were not there. The children were warned not to play near me, as though my misfortune might spread to them. When I tried to help with shared duties, collecting firewood, stirring pots, washing tin plates, people would suddenly remember tasks elsewhere, leaving me to finish the work by myself. I knew what I represented to them. I was a reminder of how fragile their own safety was, how quickly someone could fall from belonging to being unwanted. I was living proof that a wagon train could cast you aside when you became inconvenient. None of them wished to think too deeply about that truth, so they chose not to see me at all. There was one exception, a young woman named Sarah Ellis, traveling with her parents and younger brothers and sisters, would sometimes sit near me in the evenings. She did not speak much, but her quiet presence felt like mercy. Once she brought me an extra biscuit her mother had baked. Another night, she sat beside me at the campfire, after everyone else had slowly moved away. She was perhaps 16 years old, and I believe she saw in me a shadow of what might happen to her if fortune turned against her. Maybe my story frightened her. Maybe it made her more cautious about the trail, but at least she admitted that I existed. The land during those 2 weeks was beautiful beyond words. High mountain country stretched around us, clear streams shining in the sunlight, tall pine forests whispering in the wind, valleys bright with wildflowers. Yet I could not take comfort in any of it. I was traveling through country I had once dreamed of seeing, but now it held no meaning for me. It was only more miles to endure, more days to survive, more time before I would be left at a fort to decide what to do with the broken pieces of my life. We arrived at Fort Bridger in the middle of August. Captain Miller handed me $5, saying it was payment for my wagon and oxen, which he intended to keep in exchange for bringing me that far. $5 for everything James and I had purchased, with such hope for Oregon, for every sacrifice we had made. I accepted the money without protest. There was no point in arguing. I had no power left to fight. I spent 2 years at Fort Bridger. They were years of endurance rather than living. I worked in the fort kitchen, cooking for soldiers, traders and travelers who passed through. It was exhausting labor, long hours bent over hot stoves, preparing meals for dozens of men, scrubbing pots and dishes until the skin on my hands cracked and bled. I slept in a narrow room behind the dining hall, hardly large enough for a cot and a small trunk. It was freezing in winter and suffocating in summer, but it was shelter, and I had nowhere else to turn. The fort commander paid me $8 a month, with room and board included. After 2 full years, I had saved around $80, not enough to travel far, not enough to begin anew, only enough to keep me tied to the fort for survival. I lived in a strange in-between state, not a prisoner, yet not truly free. Wagon trains came and went during those 2 years. Every few weeks another company would arrive. 30 or 40 wagons filled with families carrying hope and bright plans, heading toward Oregon or California. They stopped for rest and supplies, and I saw my former self reflected in them. I saw young wives walking beside their wagons, husbands, speaking confidently of future farms, children thrilled by the promise of adventure. I longed to warn them. I wanted to tell them that the trail often took more than it ever gave back, that communities could turn cold when survival was threatened, that dreams faded quickly in the wilderness, but I kept silent. They would not have believed me. Everyone who reached the fort had already heard stories of hardship and death, yet each believed misfortune would strike someone else, not them. James and I had believed the same. The traders and soldiers treated me with a mixture of pity and quiet scorn. I was known as the widow who had been left behind, the woman who never reached Oregon. A few were gentle in their way, offering extra bread or asking how I was faring, but most viewed me as a failure, as someone too weak for frontier life. Perhaps by their measure they were correct. I had not reached Oregon. I had not built the future James imagined. By that standard, I had failed. I watched healthy travelers gather to discuss their choices. I saw the same careful calculations that had once been made about James and me. Should they slow down for the ill? Should they remain united? Should they leave someone behind? Sometimes they stayed together. Other times they voted to abandon the sick. I witnessed it happen 3 times. In those 2 years, families were left at the fort with promises that another train would return for them. Promises that were often forgotten. I saw women like myself trying to survive after being set aside. Some found employment, some remarried quickly out of need, some simply lost hope. I heard of 2 women who walked into the wilderness and never returned. I understood, odd that urge, more than I care to admit. Those years changed me. The hopeful girl from Indiana faded away at Fort Bridger and was replaced by someone more cautious, more guarded, less trusting. I learned to accept assistance without expecting affection. I learned to work without expecting thanks. I learned to survive without expecting kindness. These lessons were useful for life on the frontier, but they cost me something deep inside that I have never fully recovered. In 1867, a man named William Garrett passed through the fort. He was 45 years old, a widower traveling to California to labor in the silver mines. He required someone to cook and keep house. He offered marriage, not from love, but from necessity. He needed a wife. I needed protection and a way to leave the frontier behind. We were married at the fort and traveled to Nevada. I spent the next 31 years as William Garrett's wife. He was not cruel, yet he was not James. We had no children. He worked hard in the mines, earning enough to live modestly but never finding great fortune. He died in 1898. Since then I have lived alone in a small house in Carson City, supporting myself with sewing work. I am 75 years old now. I have lived longer than James and longer than many who walked the Oregon Trail. Yet I have never forgotten being abandoned in July of 1865. I have thought about it every single day for 56 years. I remember the vote, the faces of those who chose to leave me. I remember the wagon master Potter making the final decision. I remember the few families who argued to keep us, who were overruled. I remember watching the wagons roll away and the deep silence afterward. I understand their fear. They believed keeping us would endanger everyone, that my husband's sickness would delay them beyond safety. They thought they were choosing the greater good. I understand that reasoning. But understanding does not close the wound. Understanding does not erase the feeling of being cast aside. Understanding does not change the truth that more than 20 families looked at a young woman with a dying husband and decided she could be left alone in the wilderness. I have often wondered what became of that wagon train. Did they reach Oregon before the snows? Did abandoning us truly save them, or did delays come anyway, proving they had left us for nothing? Over the years I searched newspapers for familiar names, but never found them. They vanished into Oregon and into history. I do not know what became of any of them. I sometimes wonder if any felt regret, if any remembered us after they moved on. I would like to believe that Mrs. Morrison and Henderson and the others who voted to keep us thought of me from time to time. But perhaps they did not. Perhaps they were too busy building farms and raising families. Perhaps we became only a story they told about the harsh choices required on the trail, about the price of survival. This is what I want people to understand about the Oregon Trail and the journey west. It was not a glorious adventure. It was not romantic or heroic. It was frightened, people making painful decisions, and some of those decisions shattered lives. James and I began that journey, filled with hope. We believed we would reach Oregon together, build our farm, raise children, grow old side by side, watching the sun set over the Willamette Valley. Instead, James died alone in the wilderness, far from home, unable to fulfill his greatest wish. And I lived on, carrying the memory of what might have been, wondering how different our lives could have been if that single vote had gone another way. Dot might have built if we had simply remained in Indiana, if James had never started dreaming about Oregon. I am an old woman now, close to the final chapter of my life. Soon I will shut my eyes for the very last time. And when that moment comes, I wonder if James will be there waiting for me. I wonder if he ever learned what happened after he passed away. If he knows I was left behind. If he knows I had to marry another man just to stay alive. I wonder what he would say to me, whether he would feel proud that I endured or saddened that I let go of Oregon. I also think about Wagon Master Potter and the others who decided to leave me. If I see them again, I do not know what words I will have. I cannot say if I still hold anger in my heart or if 56 long years have finally worn it down into something gentler. Not forgiveness, no, but perhaps acceptance. Maybe only tiredness. What I am certain of is this: being deserted by that wagon train changed me forever. It stole the hopeful young girl from Indiana who believed in dreams and chances, and it left behind someone tougher, more guarded, less willing to trust. It showed me that people will protect themselves, even when it means giving you up. It showed me that community has limits, that when survival is on the line, most people will choose their own blood over strangers. These lessons are painful. I wish I had never been forced to learn them. I wish James and I had stayed in Indiana had never listened to stories of Oregon, had lived simple, quiet lives that never included wagon trains, or wild lands, or being abandoned to die. But wishes never changed anything. We did travel west. James did die. I was left alone. These events happened, and no amount of hoping can erase them. This is my testimony. This is what happened to a pioneer woman born in 1846, who made the grave mistake of marrying a man who dreamed too big, of believing that hope would be enough, of trusting that people on the frontier would show kindness and mercy to one another. I am 75 years old. I have lived 56 years longer than my first husband ever did. I survived when I was not meant to survive. I built a life, as broken as it was from the pieces of my shattered dreams, yet I have never stopped being the young girl who stood beside an unmarked grave in Wyoming and watched a wagon train fade into the distance, leaving me completely and utterly alone. That is what the Oregon Trail stole from me. Not only my husband, not only my dreams, but my faith that people would stand by each other when it truly mattered. That faith died in July of 1865, and it has never returned. That is what still troubles me. That is what I will carry with me into the grave. That is the truth about wagon trains and the long journey west that the history books rarely share. Sometimes people abandon you. Sometimes they take a vote on whether you deserve to live or die. Sometimes they choose themselves instead of you, and you survive anyway. But you are never whole again. That is my story. That is what I remember. That is what continues to haunt me after 56 long years.